Went down to Toledo, which was an overnight trip, and went to the hospital where this doctor practiced, and it was the Robin Hood Hospital. Now, it just so happened that the Robin Hood Hospital was the hospital where my aunts, Bertha and Louise Dramberg, practiced nursing. They were RNs that had received their degrees out of Robin Hood and stayed on there and were working out of Toledo. These were young girls who left Metz immediately a few days after the Metz fire, and that'll be another story that I'll talk about. Well, anyway, I don't remember what happened, but according to my mother, Louise or Bertha met us at the boat. They took us to the doctor, and it was confirmed that I had been hit by polio. Not only my leg, but it had caused a curvature of the spine. Now, nothing much happened, as I found out in later years, except they put a cast on my leg and really sent me back home. I also acquired a pair of crutches, which I used until I went into high school. I was on crutches most of the time. And just interesting to note that I'm on crutches today. I'm 82, and my old crippled leg, you might say, finally gave out entirely, so I went back on crutches for probably the rest of my life. Now, on several occasions, I recall just part of it, after about age 3, that I went back to Toledo, and then on occasion I went to see a doctor in Cleveland, again by boat. Now, it was at the doctor in Cleveland's that my dad was informed that there was a large crippled children's sanitarium or orthopedic sanitarium in St. Louis, Missouri, known as the McLean Sanitarium, where they treated polio patients as well as crippling caused by any other natural phenomena such as birth defects or accidents. And my dad made the necessary contacts, found out about the institution, and wrote them and asked them whether they would possibly accept me as a patient. They wrote back and said that to come ahead, and so arrangements were made that I go down to St. Louis, Missouri. Now, in October of 1919, we left for St. Louis, Missouri. That's my dad and my grandfather, Julius Dramberg, from Metz, my mother's father. He went along, and the idea was that if they would accept me and I would stay down there for a while as an outpatient, then my grandfather would stay with me. Now, you might say, well, how could a farmer leave his farm and go down and take time off in St. Louis, Missouri? Well, it just happened that that was the personality of my grandfather. Basically, he was not a farmer. He was a kind of a businessman. And my grandmother, Dramberg, was the farmer. She knew how to farm. She, of course, was a large lady, and she had her son, Carl, who was a large man. And between the two of them, even though Grandpa wasn't there, they managed to keep the farm going and keep everything in shape. But that's another story. My dad and my grandfather and I went to Detroit by train and stayed overnight with the Zimmermans, who were Mrs. Zimmerman was a sister to my grandfather. He was the brewmaster at the Voigt Brewery in Detroit, and that's where we stayed. The next day we caught a train for St. Louis. The name of the train I still remember today was called the Wabash Cannonball. And it went down through parts of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, along the Wabash River, and then into St. Louis, at East St. Louis and Eadsbridge, and into St. Louis itself. After making the necessary contacts at the hospital and finding out that they would accept me, and my grandfather and I, they located a good place to room and board immediately across the street from the hospital itself. Now this was a large hospital, very large hospital, and there were several hundred patients that stayed right within the confines of the building itself. And across the street and in the surrounding area, there was where the outpatients stayed. Well, we were located a nice rooming house owned by a doctor and Mrs. Carter, a rooming house where they had probably about 10 people who were connected to the McLean Sanitarium. And while there at that hospital, my dad went back, and my grandfather stayed with me down there in St. Louis for a period between about, I think it was October of 1919 to June of 1920, a period of about 8 months. And then most of the treatments that I received at that hospital were for my spine. They didn't really do too much for my leg. That was a little bit beyond them. Now, I did have a few minor operations on the leg, but they were confident that they could straighten out my curvature of the spine, and they did. Through a series of orthopedic exercises, and through heat and whirlpool, and stretching and racks, and bicycling, and exercise of every type and description that you can think of. It just like a modern physical ed gym in the city, where you see all the apparatus for bodybuilding and for first-class physical education activities. Those came out of those early orthopedic sanitariums. And a lot of the practices that are used now in chiropractic came out of those early orthopedic sanitariums. I have a book here on the McLean Orthopedic Sanitarium which describes it very, very graphically, very beautifully described, and it's quite remarkable how it matches up to some of the things that we had today. Much of the corrective work that I took part in there in that hospital took place in the morning. We'd go to the gym probably at maybe 8, 9 o'clock in the morning after breakfast, and there I would be subjected to all of these various heat treatments, including massages of various types, a lot of stretching. And then in the morning, in the afternoon, of course, we had a lot of time on our hand, and that's when we did an awful lot of walking. My grandfather, of course, Julius Grambua, was a great walker. And we walked St. Louis, Missouri from one end to the other, from north to south and up to the west as far as it went. But we did walk the levee of the Mississippi River. It fascinated me, and it also fascinated my grandfather. But we became well acquainted with a large part of St. Louis, Missouri. And one of the most memorable things that I often record, we went there many times, was Forest Park, the beautiful, beautiful municipal park in St. Louis. It's still there today, and at that time it was known as one of the most magnificent municipal parks of the United States, and it was. The beautiful displays of animals and birds, water, flowers, and just beautiful walkways. And we used to wander around there day after day at a time, buy a little lunch from one of the vendors, a little hot dog or some other small product, and with a soft drink, and just stay and almost spend the day there. Now, my grandfather, of course, as a result of this, became my favorite, Julius Grambua. And he was very kind to me, and he was a very, very excellent teacher. He taught me a lot about reading, not only in English, but he taught me a lot about reading in German. Now, I had been somewhat fluent in German as a result of my early life. When there was just my mother and dad and my brother Herman and I home, we spoke German very, very often. My mother and dad still spoke German from the time that they were both living until my dad died. You'd go over there and they'd be speaking in German. Now, they were they could switch right over to English, but German in the early days was the language of the home. But my grandfather went a little further than that. He, not only did we ask to converse with him in German, but he showed me how to write the German script, which is very difficult. And I practiced and practiced and practiced primarily to please him. And I got so that I even wrote a few small letters home to my parents in the German script. I still have a couple of those pieces of those letters left that my mother saved for me, and they're kind of interesting to look at. Now, the place we stayed in St. Louis, as I say, was owned by a doctor, and there were probably 10 people as the room and boarders there. And he was a doctor, but he practiced downtown. He did not practice out of that home in that place. The maids, the cooks, and the people who did the washing and the ironing and the laundering and the dusting and the cleaning were all black ladies. And they were excellent cooks. That's, of course, the one that I remember about primarily. And grandfather and I had to get used to some of the little different type of cooking than what we had up here in northern Michigan. One thing I remember that we had quite frequently, a couple times a week, was fish. I didn't know it at the time, but I found out afterwards that it was catfish. That was a very common form of food for the people there. And of course, the Mississippi River area is known for its great catfish fishing. And another one of the varieties of food that I became very accustomed to was sweet potatoes. Many of those people, now they did serve both sweet and white potatoes at most meals. But the sweet potato was also used for frying. It was used for several types of puddings, sweet potato pie, and it was very, very common. And I like it. I still like it today. And then there was a lot of cornmeal used, cornmeal mush, both warm and cold. And there were lots of puddings. Not too much in the way of pie, a lot of puddings, and the dessert usually was cake. This would be a pancake, a flat cake, not tier cake, but a flat cake. That was a very, very common form of dessert. Sometimes there was a little something served on top of the cake. Other times it was just probably a straight cake, similar to what we would call a butter cake, or there's another common name. I can't think of it right now. There were a lot of corn fritters and corn-related dishes. And this is stuff that came out of their people, the heritage of those people there also. And there was very little beef served. We had quite a bit of chicken. We had quite a bit of ham. We had quite a ham and bacon-related products, and but not much beef. Now, when we left Detroit after I got through with my treatment down there, and not much, as I say, happened to the crippled leg itself, or to the crippled foot, which was very severely crippled, but the back was straightened out in very, very good shape. We returned to Detroit. I remember at that time, my grandfather and I, we stopped in again at Detroit and stayed at Grosse Ile, the summer home of his sister, Mrs. Zimmerman, Mrs. Marie Zimmerman, sometimes referred to as Mary. And you got to remember that just at this time, the nation had voted prohibition. And so the brewery was in the process of being sold, dismantled, and all of the equipment, all the horses, all the wagons had to be disposed of. And of course, a good number of people were put out of a job. Now, some of the breweries stayed on for a while, and they made what they call near beer. Some of them became the headquarters for the soft drink business, but some of them, and I know with Voigt, they just quit it entirely, and the people there just went into other lines of work. They did the brewery that Ed Voigt had. Well, Ed Voigt had married my grandfather's sister, and Augusta, and after they came over to this country, shortly after they came over to this country, they came to Detroit, and then some of the girls stayed there. Two of the girls stayed there and got married, the other girls came north here. 4 other girls came north and married in this area here. And I might add about that. A couple of years later, I think it was 1922, I came back in 1922, my grandfather and I went back for a period of about 6 to 8 weeks to St. Louis and to the sanitarium. They wanted to not only check my spine, but they had developed certain other exercises or things that they wanted to do, and they also wanted to take another look at my foot. But I really think that the foot was too badly crippled, I think, for their work down there. They did minor surgery, and I said that they did perform 2 minor operations. And so my grandfather and I went back for a period of time, and we didn't stay in the same house, but we did stay in the same area, just probably a half block away. And then, as I mentioned once previously, that after we came back in 1924 and 25, I started treatment on my leg and foot at the Shriners Hospital in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The Shriners Hospital had been started in San Francisco, and then their second unit that they built in Minneapolis, and that's where I stayed. Today I want to continue the story of my of polio and the things and the way it affected my life. As I mentioned once before, after St. Louis, Missouri, the last trip down there about 1922, I stayed at home for a period of time, and then my dad found out about the Shriners Hospital in Minneapolis, and what that was available for treatment of people who had suffered polio and other disabling diseases, mostly children, young people. I, through the assistance of some local people who belonged to the Shrine, I went up there along with my dad in the fall of 1924 and was admitted for treatment. We went by way of Mackinac City, the Straits of Mackinac, and took a train up to Trout Lake and then caught the Sioux Line into Minneapolis. I think, as I say, it was in the fall of the year, and I stayed at that hospital there until the next May. I had a series of 4 operations on the foot, and the foot was straightened up to the extent that I could wear a shoe quite comfortably, and with the assistance of, and didn't necessarily have to wear crutches, which was a big treat for me. The hospital itself, the Twin Cities Shriners Hospital, was located on the banks of the Mississippi River right in Minneapolis, and it was only a short distance from the University of Minnesota. All that'll come later. While there at the hospital, I did go to school. It was a kind of arcade arrangement with all students, of course, attending the same school at different periods. And certain times the boys would go, certain times the girls would go. And most of the emphasis, as far as I was concerned, was on reading and on mathematics and spelling and writing. Probably somewhat similar to what they would have in a typical one-room school in a rural area. And now the Shriners Hospitals, of course, are they are set up by the Shriners, a group of it's Masonic order, and everything at that hospital, even today, is absolutely free. There's no charge for any of the services that they perform. And I think at the present time they have probably 12 or 14 hospitals which are located throughout the United States. The one in Minneapolis was the second one. The first one started out in San Francisco. They just do fantastic work in working with young people who have been hit. Now, of course, polio scourge is somewhat past, although occasionally, I suppose, for some people who are not immunized, it will still hit. But they're crippling diseases that come in at all times with young people. And a lot of crippling, of course, takes place in people born with crippling disabilities. But as I say, the Shriners Hospital do wonderful work all over the United States and in Canada. I might say that while I was in St. Louis, or in Minneapolis, Aunt Louise was living there, married to Ed Olson, and Aunt Bertha was also living there. She was stationed at Fort Snelling Veterans Hospital I believe it's in St. Paul. Now, Louise had worked there previously, and I believe that's where she met Ed Olson. Ed was a veteran of World War I. He'd been in the Navy, been stationed in the South Pacific, where his port of call, I remember he told me, was Singapore. And he contracted some type of one of those tropical diseases and became somewhat disabled. Now, Ed was originally a graduate of North Dakota State College and had been what we would call an agricultural agent. But he apparently decided, as a result of military experience, to try something else. There apparently was some assistance, similar to what we call the GI Bill that came out after World War II, and so he decided to go into dentistry, which he did at the University of Minnesota. And when I was at the hospital, Twin City Shriners Hospital, he was finishing up at the University of Minnesota, and they lived in a little apartment just off campus. Dorothy May was a little girl, probably about 3 or 4 years old. When I talked to her last, she says she doesn't remember too much, except that I was there occasionally. Ed and Louise would come and get me. They had a model old Ford. They'd come up, it wasn't too far, only about 2 miles away. They'd come up and get me for a weekend, and I'd stay in the apartment with them. And we'd ride around the country on Saturday or Sunday. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful experience for me. And remember that Bertha was also there, Aunt Bertha. She was stationed right at Fort Snelling. It's interesting to note that Ed Olson and his wife Louise are both buried in the military hospital in Fort Snelling. I found that out from their daughter Dorothy May Johnson. Until about May of the following year, it went in October. As I say, I had a series of 4 operations on my leg, and then was discharged, and I came back home alone. And then later on 2 occasions in the following years, I did go back just for a checkup. I would take the train, this would probably be in the summertime, take the train and go to Minneapolis. Louise and Edwin no longer lived there, but I kind of knew my way around. I would just get off at the railroad station and hire a taxi and take me out to the Shriners Hospital. And I'd made arrangements previously. I would stay there overnight while they kind of checked me over and took some pictures and had a half dozen doctors come and take a look at me to see what had happened over a period of a year or 2. Now you got to remember that a lot of the doctors who did the operations, of course, were full-fledged doctors, but they were also training a lot of young doctors who were coming out of the University of Minnesota. And so that hospital, being not too far away from the med school, there were always a lot of young doctors that were roaming around the halls, making observations or moving along with other doctors observing as to what happened. And it was a very, very interesting procedure that they used there. And so after that, there was no more corrective work done on my leg, even up to this day, other than the final work that they did at the Shriners Hospital in Minneapolis. Now I want to comment on a variety of subjects that people have asked me to touch on. They won't follow any particular sequence, just as they come up or as people suggest them to me. Now, one of the things that I find that people have interest in, younger people, is that at the site on 3rd Street where my parents had their home, where I grew up, we had a flowing well. That well was put down just previous to the time that the home was built there, and it was a flowing well, an artesian well, that when it had enough power in it, so that if you attached a 3/4 inch hose, you could throw a stream of water right over the top of the house. It was that powerful. So consequently, it was easier at that time immediately to put in a indoor toilet system rather than an outdoor system, which so many people had, because this was powerful enough to operate it. And of course, it supplied all the money or all the water for the kitchen and for washing in the basement. It was a real find. Now, there are a good number of artesian wells in the community, and later on, of course, after the city water system came in, it was attached to that. Now, originally, that water was very, very powerful, and then later years, of course, it kind of slacked off somewhat, and that's when, but at that time, electricity was available in the community. It wasn't available immediately. We had to wait for a while before electricity would become the original home. We used lamps. And then afterwards, the house was wired for electricity. After electricity became available, a power company was set up. Electricity was manufactured at Michigan Lime for their own use, and they sold surplus to the city of Rogers City, and a power company was built at Rogers City Electric. And that Rogers City Electric was originally located just a short distance away from us on Woodward Avenue, at the corner of Woodward and 2nd Street, just back of the so-called Chabella's garage, or the Chabella home. Originally, that home there belonged to Dr. Arscott, but immediately in back of that is where Michigan Lime had their headquarters. Later on, first it was the Rogers City Power Company, and then later on it was used as the headquarters for the Michigan Limestone offices. But to get back to that water system, that water system also ran a cooler, a water cooler. We had a water cooler in the home in place of an ice box for summer purposes. The water was piped into a box-like affair where the water flowed through coils, and on top of the coil were pieces of tin, and this was a box-like affair, and that temperature was around 50 or 52 degrees. It kept butter, it kept cream, it kept cheese, and kept cooked meats and a few things like that from spoiling for a period of time. And a lot of people, of course, did have ice. Ice was available in the community, and there were large quantities of ice that were put up every fall in the vicinity of a little lake, and that served the community for ice purposes. And of course, large quantities of ice were also used by the fishing industry, which was very, very big at that time in Rogers City, fishing out of Lake Huron. Now, other things I want to talk about that some of the members of the family asked me to comment on briefly was that in the fall of the year, every year and for many years, my parents made sausage. And in the fall, probably around November, my dad would buy a hog dressed out, and the whole hog was brought in. He used to cut it in 2 pieces, and this was usually probably on a Saturday when my dad was around, and we got a little help probably from my grandparents, and the hog was cut up. The hams were cut out, The bacon areas were cut out, and those were put into a brine, and then after a few days brining, they were taken to the Platts market, and those hams were smoked, and became a source of smoked ham for the winter season. Now the rest of the meat was taken off the carcass, and a large part of it was ground up, mixed with a certain amount of fresh beef, put through a meat grinder, a heavy-duty sausage grinder, and that was cut into small pieces, and just like you would do today to a small hand grinder, you just put the sausage in there, put the meat in there, and it went through, and it came out like a hamburger-like substance. And after the pork was ground and the beef was ground, it was put into a large tub, even a wash tub. And there it was paddled, there it was mixed, thoroughly mixed. The beef and the pork were thoroughly mixed. And there was a lot of meat on a hog. And of course, the fat was trimmed off, fat was rendered and made into lard. There was a lot of meat that came off the front part of the hog, plus the loins. And in certain cases, the loins were saved, but most of the time it was just used for sausage. And after that was thoroughly ground, thoroughly mixed with paddles, wooden paddles, like paddles that they used to paddle butter. And it was thoroughly mixed, and then a certain amount of salt, and a certain amount of pepper, a certain amount of spices like marjoram or sage or thyme was added, and that was again thoroughly mixed, thoroughly mixed, thoroughly mixed, thoroughly mixed. Now this was usually quite a crew of people that were involved in this. Sometimes the aunts, uncles, or other neighbors would come in and assist. I remember Tante Petalcow being there, and the Mrs. Schultz being there, and the Mrs. Harmon being there. There were a lot of the elderly people, of course, who understood, and they'd come off the farms themselves. They knew exactly what to do. After the mixture was thoroughly mixed, then it was again put through the machine, and then the machine emptied out through a cone, and in that cone was inserted the casing. Casings were probably about 24 inches long, maybe about an inch in diameter. The ground meat was put into that casing, and then after it was full, it was tied off, and a ring was made. The parts were brought together, and they're tied together, and the rings that you see in an old-fashioned butcher shop, that's what it was made. That's how they made that. Then after all the sausage was made that they wanted to make, then that sausage was taken down to Platts market again, and he commercially smoked not only the ham, and he smoked not only the ham and the bacon, but he smoked commercially for other people in the community. There were a lot of people in the community that were making their own sausage, and in fact they still do. In fact, the machine, or the sausage making machine that my mother and dad had, is still out in the country. Gerald and B. Grambua have it, and I guess they still make sausage out there with that machine. It's a heavy-duty outfit that has a certain number of blades that cut the meat into various sizes, and it takes a good strong arm to run through 100 pounds of sausage meat for grinding, I'm telling you. So that's what happened. After that sausage was smoked, then it was brought back, and in our case, in our home, it was stored in a little place immediately adjacent to the back entrance. There was a little cubbyhole there where the hams and the bacon and the sausage hung from the roof. And as you wanted something, you just went out there and cut it off. You brought the ham in, cut up as much ham as you wanted for dinner, or as much sausage as you wanted for dinner, or breakfast, or lunch, or whatever it happened to be, and then put the rest back. And then usually by the spring or by the following summer, most of that was gone. See, it had to be smoked or salted or brined in order to be kept, because you didn't have enough refrigeration in the average home. Now, some of the other meat products that were made at the time that they made sausage, I recall my mother and dad. My mother made head cheese. This was taking certain select cuts of meat and putting it very fine and using a certain amount of seasoning. You made what was called a head cheese. Very, very delicious. They also made another product called pickled pig knuckles or pickled pig's feet, which it could include any part of the hog. That is, I mean, it didn't have to include the feet, but in certain cases they did include certain portions of the leg or lower leg. And it was very, very delicious. In fact, if you buy it in the stores today, it's quite expensive. But there was a way of pickling that up, making a kind of a gelatin, and it was just served as a kind of a little snack at fairs, Christmas time or Easter time or whatever it might be. Now, I might say that many people made this sausage, and a lot of the Polish people made this sausage. Many of the Polish people made the sausage, but they used a little different kind of flavoring, and we call it today, they call it kielbasa. Sometimes it was made and served fresh, sometimes it was smoked just similar to the German smoked sausage. But it's very, 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 very delicious. And there, of course, there were other types of sausage that were made by certain people. Some people made sausage like blood sausage. They made liver sausage. They made bratwurst. They made knockwurst. And all various kinds. Some even made potato sausage. And there were other things that were made by many different people. And so, well, I might say, well, on the subject of food, I should mention my mother's great wheat bread. Mother was a great wheat bread baker, and in every fall, my dad would go out and get several hundred pounds of wheat that he took to one of the mills, like Iluski's mill, and had it ground for the purpose of making bread. Now, Mother did make white bread too, but her specialty, I would say, and most people agree, was her great wheat bread. I know that most of the kids got the formula afterwards. I was down to Martha's, George's the other day, and they made, Martha had this wonderful bread that was made on the same formula that my mother used to make out of. My mother primarily was a great, as I say, wheat bread, and she made beautiful white bread rolls. She did make other things too, as far as that's concerned. She had other specialties that she quite common with her. I noticed that Mother was a good roast beef maker. She could make wonderful roast beef with the brown gravy. I can even taste it yet today. And you got to remember that, like so many people, I suppose, of German origin, and maybe Polish too, potatoes were the staple of almost every evening meal. Potatoes and gravy, or rice potatoes. There was mashed potatoes. There was fried potatoes. There was refried potatoes. There was fresh fried potatoes, and then there was baked potatoes. And that was the staple. That's where you started from. And I often think also that another thing that in our home, when all 6 kids were there, all 6 of us going to school, that we had soup for almost every single meal at noon during the time that we were going to school. That was the standard. Soup and bread and butter was the meal at noon. Soup, my mother made soup out of everything that you could think of. There was no hot lunch, and so we all came home at school. We had about an hour and 15 minutes, and everybody came home. Most of the kids, there were a few kids that lived quite a distance out that brought their own lunch, but generally speaking, most kids cleared out and went home at noon. And some kids had a good mile almost to go, but with an hour and 15 minutes, they were able to make it and mostly get back. Now, Dad, you got to remember too, worked at the bank, and he was only about 3 blocks away, the same distance as the schools, And so he came home. So at practically every meal, all during our years, we all got together at breakfast, we all got together at the noon lunch, we all got together at supper or dinner at night. And that's where a lot of the information about the family came to be. But as I say, talk about the soup. We had pea soup. We had bean soup. We had dried bean soup. We had fresh bean soup. We had green beans. We had vegetables soup, vegetable and beef soup. The vegetables came out of the garden again. We had carrot soup, potato soup, rutabaga soup, corn soup, onion soup, milk and cabbage soup, and beef with vegetables. If soup could be made, Mother made soup out of it. So as I say, we got together 3 times a day, and at every meal, and that's where a lot of the information about the day's event took place. Was at the kitchen, dining room, or supper table or lunch table. That's where all the information that came out during the day was moved around. We found out what everybody was doing. We did a lot of listening, we did a lot of talking, but it developed good listening and talking skills. And everybody got a chance to sound off. And it was also a good place for our parents to spell out what they expected from us in the way of school and the progress at school. And it was also a good time for us to get our orders, you might say. And we learned how to play into how to obey orders. All 6 of us kids, and I don't think there are any exception, got spanked for being out of line. That was the accepted way of doing it in those days. Now they call it cruel and unusual punishment. Well, we didn't think of it that way. I guess none of us did. The girls usually got whacked on the behind with the palm of the hand. The boys with a razor strap or a razor strap. There was a leather and fabric belt-like device that was used to sharpen old-fashioned straight razors that men used before there was the safety razor or the electric razor. Now, when that was laid on the behind, it made a loud noise. And that was part of the terror of that thing. The noise, it stung too. It stung the behind, but the noise, there was a large clop. And kids always talked about getting razor stropped. But it was a good streak. Clop. And kids always talked about getting razor stropped. But it was a good streak.